Good morning, good afternoon, or possibly good evening, depending on where your current location is. I guess for this seminar, we may have viewers all the way from Hawaii to Seoul. First, I would like to extend a big thank you and a warm welcome to our four distinguished speakers. Great to have you all on board. And also, a sincere welcome to our online viewers. We do hope this webinar will be an interesting session, and I encourage our viewers to ask questions using the Q&A function just described by Ebba. This webinar is not just about OPCON transfer. It also marks the start of a new partnership between the Institute for Security and Development Policy and the Korea Defense Veterans Association. We at ISDP are very happy for this partnership and of course hope to be able to conduct more collaborative efforts with KDVR in the future. OPCON transfer is an issue having been discussed between the United States and the Republic of Korea since the early 1990s. It contains numerous political, military, strategic, and other aspects. When President Moon won the election in 2017, OPCON transfer gained prominence as he ran on a promise to complete OPCON transfer before the end of his presidential term in 2022. A lot has already been achieved to meet that target, but still a few issues remain open. In today's webinar, we hope to offer various perspectives on why this is an important issue, what are the driving arguments, the key issues, but also to provide insight into how OPCON transfer, when it happens, may impact on the role and working conditions of the United Nations Command and the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. Our four eminent speakers will guide you through these issues, and I will try to introduce them one at a time. They will speak for about 10 minutes each. After we will have maybe a few comments from my side and open up for a general Q&A session. But you are, as I mentioned, welcome to write your questions during the presentations as well. I would first like to invite and introduce Lieutenant General Chun In-bum from South Korea. General Bum has held numerous commands as battalion, regimental, and division commander, as well as several key staff appointments. One being, in fact, director of OPCON Transition Group at the Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff. He has also served at the multinational forces in Iraq and been deployed to Afghanistan. In 2013, he became the Deputy Chief of Staff for Combined Forces Command and the senior member of the United Nations Military Armistice Commission. Later that year, he was promoted to his current rank of Lieutenant General and was assigned as the commander of the ROK Special Warfare Command. His last military assignment was as a deputy commander for the 1st ROK Army. After leaving active service, General Chun conducted several fellowships at Brookings, Johns Hopkins, and Georgia Tech. He is currently the Vice President of the Korea Freedom Federation and, since a couple of days, a guest researcher here in Stockholm at ISDP. General, the word is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mats. I'm privileged and honored to be the first speaker. And I'm assuming that most of us are familiar with the background of OPCON transition and how it has progressed. I just want to say to the audience that, for the record, that the Moon administration, especially President Moon, never really said that he wanted to have OPCON transition within his term. What he said was that he would do his best to have OPCON within his term. Having said that, his first Minister of Defense, Minister Song, acted as if that their goal was to have OPCON transition within this year. And therefore, nobody was in a position to ask if the Moon administration had changed their initial position. And we came to the conclusion that OPCON transition was something that the Moon administration had a goal to achieve within their term. I still believe that that is not the case. Another point that I would like to make is that the comments that are coming out from open source about the recent SCM, the Security Consultative Meeting between the United States and the Republic of Korea, in which there seems to have been some disagreement on the transition of OPCON. One of the statements that was reported by the Donghwa-ilbo said that, quote, "We should not be unreasonable about transitioning OPCON within the Moon administration," which means that the Moon administration people are thinking that, you know, they should not be unreasonable in trying to push OPCON within their term. What worries me with this second development is that it has given the impression to the Korean people that the United States is unwilling to have OPCON transition, which I believe is not the case. And this is something that we need to guard and be very clear about. OPCON transition, although it is a bilateral process and agreement, it is not to my understanding, the US position where they are unwilling to transition the operational control of South Korean forces to the Republic of Korea. A third point that I would like to make is the OPCON conditions-based OPCON transition plan, the COTP. We have three major conditions that we have been adhering to, and about 150 subtasks to achieve these goals. I feel that most of these are intangible goals and they're not very clear. And for me, I had been advocating that we should be looking to more practical goals. For instance, more realistic training for the South Korean military. This is something that the South Koreans should be more than capable of doing on their own without any kind of assistance. I don't see that. I'm very concerned about this. I also think that as a South Korean that we should have better training for our reserve forces. And finally, that we should revamp and reorganize our mobilization plan and make it more realistic. All of these should be the more tangible goals added to the ones that we already have that can be measured on a more practical scale. Finally, I applaud the fact that the Republic of Korea and the United States has agreed to maintain the Combined Forces Command, which will be led by a Korean 4-star. But I am also under no illusion that it will be very difficult and there will be many challenges. The challenge that I am most concerned about is that the questions that are being asked about OPCON right now by the Koreans, namely the fact that why are South Korean troops being operationally controlled by Americans, will be asked by Americans themselves. They will ask, why are American troops under operational control of the Koreans? Not knowing what operational control really is. It's just a matter of a command relationship that has set goals that have been set by the National Command Authority of both nations. And without this kind of understanding, it will be very difficult for this kind of relationship to continue. So I'm very concerned that that might be in peril. And finally, I don't see the kind of realistic dialogue that we need for the impact that OPCON transition will have on the United Nations Command and also the NNSC. I am especially concerned that segments of South Korean society have identified wrongly the role of the United Nations Command, and the attacks and the fake news that they have perpetrated towards the United Nations Command. I just can't understand why they are doing this. The South Korean community really needs to focus and look at what is the truth pertaining to the United Nations Command, and think about how and what the future of the United Nations Command should be. And I feel that this is today's webinar is a good start to open this discussion. Thank you.
Mats, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you very much, General Chun, for giving us this head start on this complicated issue of OPCON transfer. Next, I would like to turn to Mr. David Maxwell. David Maxwell is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, FDD, but he is also a 30-year veteran of the United States Army, retiring in 2011 as a Special Forces Colonel, with his final assignment being teaching national security strategy at the National War College. Mr. Maxwell has extensive experience from Asia and the Korean Peninsula, having served in this region for some 20 years in various command and staff assignments, one being at the United Nations Command J3 branch and another as the Chief of Staff of the United States Special Forces Command in Korea. Following retirement from the Army, he served as the Associate Director of the Security Studies Program at Georgetown University for several years, and since 2018, he is the Senior Fellow at FDD. He currently also teaches unconventional warfare and special operations for policy makers and strategists. That sounds very impressive, David, at the Daniel Morgan Graduate School for National Security. Mr. Maxwell will offer us a US perspective on the OPCON issue. So please, David.
Thank you, Mats. And I really like to echo the comments that General Chun just offered us. Yeah, I think that OPCON transition, which I think it's transition versus transfer, but I think OPCON transition is one of the most important issues for the alliance. I fully support it, but it's also one of the most misunderstood, as General Chun has laid out. And in fact, the one recommendation that I will make, and my bottom line up front, is that we need to do a better job, and particularly the Korean military, the US military, and the experts in both militaries need to do a better job of explaining what OPCON transition is, why it's important, and how it is progressing. And I think that the lack of really an information program, an education program to educate both the political leaders, the pundits, the press, and the public is what causes the confusion, misunderstanding, and even conspiracy theories that exist out there among the public. And I think, initially it's on the Korean side, but as General Chun said, that when a Korean general takes command of the ROK-US CFC, many Americans are going to be wondering about the Pershing Rule, which is really, goes back to World War I, but many believe that we should not put US forces under command of a foreign officer. So I expect that there will be controversy in the United States unless we properly inform and educate, the public and the press and the politicians. Now, let me say that, to debunk some of the myths, the US government does not control Korean forces. The ROK-US Combined Forces Command has operational control of both Korean forces and US forces. And that commander, the current commander, General Abrams, and just like all the previous commanders have noted that they work equally for both countries. And I expect that when the Korean general takes command, that he will say that he works for both presidents, the presidents of Korea and the president of the United States, through the military committee. And that military committee is really what provides strategic guidance and oversight of the ROK-US Combined Forces Command. So I think it's really important to understand that the United States government does not control Korean forces. And when the transition is complete with a Korean general, the Korean government will not control US forces. The same command relationship with the ROK-US Combined Forces Command will exist today and in the future. And I think that's very important to understand. But of course, there's much controversy surrounding this. On the Korean side, there is the perception that this is a sovereignty issue. And really since 1978 and the establishment of the ROK-US Combined Forces Command, both countries have co-equally owned this command. And this command is responsible for deterrence and defense, at the guidance of both governments. And it will continue that way. Now, I was happy to hear General Chun talk about President Moon's views on the timing, because I think that's very important. Timing, I think that's a political desire, which we respect, but the conditions are really most important, because failure to meet the conditions can put the command and, most importantly, the Republic of Korea at risk. If we're not able to accomplish those 155 mission essential tasks and meet the 3 basic conditions that I think General Chun is right, they are fairly subjective, but they're also developed and assessed by military professionals. But if we're unable to meet that, it will put South Korea at risk. And so that is why the conditions-based process is so important. Respecting the fact that Korea wants this to occur as rapidly as possible. But we really need to put security first and political consideration second, although that may be a very naive statement, I understand. We've been delayed in the process because we had to cancel our training last winter because of COVID-19, and then we were not able to conduct the full operational capability certification during the exercise, the training in August, because we had to focus on readiness. And the military leaders, Korean and US, determined that readiness really needed to be the priority. And they had to forego the fully operational capability certification. Now, I'd just like to touch on the United Nations Command. And there's a perception out there among many or among some in Korea that, as General Chun said, that America may not want to complete OPCON transition, which I think is false. I think our leadership is committed to it. But also that there's a perception that somehow the United States wants the United Nations Command to become the higher headquarters. Well, we're not in 1950 to 53. And the United Nations Command, of course, has responsibility for the armistice that many of the experts on this panel can talk about. But it also, should there be a resumption of hostilities, it will serve as a headquarters to receive the forces from sending states who want to contribute to the defense of South Korea. And the relationship between the United Nations Command and the ROK-US CFC should be one of a force provider, where the commanding general of the ROK-US CFC requires forces or requests forces for certain tactical missions of a certain duration and a certain location. And the United Nations commander can coordinate that and ensure the right forces that have the right national caveats adjudicated are provided for those specific missions. And so I think that's really important. And so I also think that given the declining military age demographics in South Korea, if there are hostilities, if they resume, it will be important that there is a large commitment of international forces, perhaps to make up for the military manpower of the declining size of the future ROK Army. Lastly, I think that it's most important that a Korean general commands the ROK-US CFC. Whatever happens on the Korean Peninsula, whether there is war, whether there is regime collapse, instability, any kind of contingencies that require military operations inside North Korea, I believe should be led by a Korean general. That is for the long-term legitimacy of the eventual unification process, which I believe will result in a united Republic of Korea, but also to reduce the perception that the United States is in charge and is acting as an occupying power. The importance of the ROK-US Combined Forces Command, the transition process, it is a maturation of the alliance, a movement to a really equal partnership in the alliance, and it provides an opportunity for the United States to support its ally South Korea, our blood ally, in accomplishing the long-term strategic goals of both deterrence and defense of South Korea, and ultimately, whatever happens on the peninsula, ultimately a unified Korean peninsula. And the military forces, if they have to operate inside North Korea, are going to have to provide military support to that unification process, which is another reason why it should be led by a Korean general. And that's why I fully support the OPCON transition process. I think the United States supports it. I think it's the right thing to do. And I give kudos to ISDP and to KDVA for organizing this, because I think it's most important that we address these issues to help the press, the public, the political leaders, and the pundits to understand this OPCON transition process. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It seems that you and General Chun is in much agreement, which is a good sign for moving this question and issue forward. Our third speaker today is General Vincent Brooks. General Brooks is currently the chairman and president of the Korea Defense Veterans Association, our partner organization for today's seminar. He has a very impressive military record, including several command assignments, including in Kosovo and Iraq. He also has extensive experience from the Middle East and the Gulf, having served at United States Central Command in different positions. His last active duty assignment was as the commander of the United Nations Command and the ROK-US Combined Forces Command and the US Forces Korea Command from 2016 to 2018. General Brooks retired from the US Army in January 2019, after in his final assignment as a 4-star general, having command of over 600,000 assigned Korean soldiers under arms. General Brooks is widely respected as a speaker and leader of cohesive, innovative organization, and is a life member of the Council of Foreign Relations. General Brooks serves on several boards and is also a visiting senior fellow at the Harvard University and a distinguished fellow at the University of Texas. General Brooks will talk about the United Nations role and perspective on OPCON. Please, sir.
Well, Mats, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to ISDP for the privilege of being able to participate in this seminar on a topic that I think is very timely and very important. And let me also say, as the chairman and president of the Korean Defense Veterans Association, how much we appreciate the partnership that we now have with ISDP, and I look forward to seeing that flourish, and that more of the world can be well informed on what it is that has been happening on the Korean Peninsula and what is yet to come. And so today's discussion certainly addresses that, and it's always a great privilege to be on with people who really know the business here, as you've heard already from General Chun In-bum and from David Maxwell, two very knowledgeable Korea watchers with firsthand experience. And I'd like to consider myself that also. I certainly have a lot of firsthand experience in Korea. I have a appreciation for the complexities of what happens on the Korean Peninsula. Then, of course, Mats, being with you and Urs Gerber once again, the former heads of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission during my time there, and thank you for your years of service of observing the process of maintaining armistice, which is really important. So let me jump in on a few things here, and certainly I agree with the comments that have been made by my colleagues already, both of whom have articulated some of the nuances of this understanding of operational control of forces in wartime. And that's the full description of it. It's operational control of forces in wartime. So it's specifically about a wartime condition and how the forces of the two binational alliance countries, the United States and the Republic of Korea, will meld together. And remember, the headquarters for that is the Republic of Korea US Combined Forces Command. It's a standing headquarters. It's unique in the world that is a standing binational command. For every position that has an American, there's a position in a counterpart that has a Korean. Some of the principals are Korean and the deputies are Americans. Some of the principals are Americans and the deputies are Koreans. And beginning at the very top with the commander and the deputy commander, both 4-star generals, one from the Republic of Korea, the deputy commander, one from the United States, the commander. That would change when we have the transfer of operational control. And I agree with David's point about the word transition. The process indeed is a transition from one person controlling to another in a slightly different arrangement. But the structure above it, as has been articulated, remains the same. And this was an important arrival for us as we discussed it during my time as the commander in theater, and certainly my predecessors and successor have also discussed this, that it's critically important that an alliance command, the Republic of Korea U.S. Combined Forces Command, remain under alliance control. All right, so the authorities derived from the two presidents through the Minister or Secretary of Defense, through the two Joint Chiefs of Staff, the two chairmen, into the commander. And it doesn't matter whether the commander is an American or Korean. That's the structure. And the commander is expected to act and inform on account of both countries, keeping them well informed and keeping them connected. And obviously it's a bit of a triangular structure where the peer-to-peer communications are also very important. President to president, minister to secretary, chairman to chairman, and the commander informing both lines. So I've just articulated the structure that exists already and has existed since 1978. That is the structure for operational control of forces in wartime. It was, it will be. So there is not a sovereignty question. And I agree with the points that have been made about this perception of sovereignty, particularly in South Korea, which feels that it has been somehow subjugated by the authorities of United Nations Command since 1950. And there is some truth in that in the early years. But the decisions that have been made to transfer operational control of forces in Armistice, as Ambassador Kathy Stevens has asked, was a decision made much earlier. That was day-to-day operations, protecting peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, guarding against incursions or aggressive acts by North Korea, and there were many, particularly in the late 1960s, and again, with spots all the way up until just within a few years. The day-to-day work of defending the Republic of Korea is done by the Republic of Korea Armed Forces under the control of the South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff, okay? As it should be. That's where sovereignty comes in. Now, having said that, there are some limits on sovereignty as it regards the Armistice Agreement, which has been faithfully enacted since 1953 and overseen by people like Gerber and Syngman, the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. And it has been the responsibility of United Nations Command with the view that all former combatants will comply with the instructions through a military armistice commission. Now, to be sure, that has atrophied somewhat, particularly because of North Korea's very spotty participation in that military armistice commission. North Korea essentially withdrew from it and tried to delegitimate it as people like General Chun In-bum, a Republic of Korea general, became the senior member of the Military Armistice Commission. North Korea walked away at that point in time. And it has been very difficult to re-engage. There have been re-engagements. The one that's most notable in my mind is the engagements that happened at general officer level between United Nations Command and the Korea People's Army. It's military to military discussions that opened the door to the repatriation of human remains that had been in North Korea's possession. This happened, of course, in the late summer, early fall of 2018. A momentous event, and one of the outcomes of the Singapore summit, indeed the only one that has been fulfilled from the Singapore summit. So UN Command does have the ability to hit the brakes on escalation being done by a country, United States or South Korea, and to enforce the conditions of armistice. And so I guess in that regard, there is some impact to sovereignty, but it's about ensuring compliance, a sovereign decision to comply that is enforced by a third body, and that's United Nations Command, and with the support of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. So I wanted to just lay that out to make it very clear. We're not talking about sovereignty when we talk about operational control. Now, national command authority, David touched on this, is a very important point, because the discussion after the transfer happens between a Korean and an American in the lead, suddenly America will be having that conversation. The Pershing Rule will be discussed, and it will be ill-informed just as much as the view of sovereignty in South Korea is ill-informed. It's not correct, it's not related. The Pershing Rule is about command of US forces in wartime, being subordinated to a commander. This is a nuance that needs to be understood. I will certainly say that from my experience in Kosovo, I had a non-American commander of the Kosovo force. It was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization command. And a North Atlantic Treaty Organization general was put in charge of the Kosovo force. And I was a subordinate to that general. That general exercised control of the US forces and all other national forces that had been committed, but did not exercise national command. That was retained by the United States. So the United States could say, we're not doing what you told us to do. We will do only these things. We have these national caveats. We will not engage in such operations or these operations. And every country that provides forces, this is particularly relevant with the United Nations Command, but applies also to Combined Forces Command, has national caveats because it retains national command. Now, this is a nuance, and that can be confusing outside of military practice and experience, but it's well understood within military practice. It's not understood as well politically, and that's why the discussion tends to drift. So there is a need for discussion about these types of things. What does it really mean to have a transfer to a South Korean-led command versus an American-led command? I mean, South Korean as a person, American as a person, not a nation. Now, there are some challenges that await, and I'll begin to wrap up on this point. As the commander of the Republic of Korea U.S. Combined Forces Command, I had access to both national chains, as I've already expressed. But to be clear, my contact was far more frequent through the totality of the South Korean side than it was with the totality of the American side. Why is that? Well, Korea is one of the many military challenges faced by the United States, one of many. There are multiple commanders out there, the geographic combatant commanders and functional combatant commanders, most notably, and subordinate unified commanders like US Forces Korea. So I wasn't talking to President Trump all the time or President Obama before him, since I served both, and only had one experience with each one of them, face to face. However, my engagements with the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs were frequent in that role. In other words, I was talking to the military committee and to the security consultation mechanism. Those are the two echelons above the combined force headquarters. But on the South Korean side, I had daily contact with the chairman of the South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff, weekly contact, sometimes more frequent depending on what was going on with the Minister of Defense, periodic contact as needed, maybe as once or twice a month with the National Security Advisor for the Republic of Korea, National Security Director to be more precise, and frequent contact with the President of the Republic of Korea. We met maybe 8 or 9 times. Will that be replicated when the lead changes? Can we reasonably expect the South Korean general to be in frequent contact with the US Secretary of Defense or with the US President? The answer is no. We cannot reasonably expect that. And so that part of it will not be replicated. It will not flip. That means that the South Korean leadership will have considerably more contact with the South Korean general leading the Combined Forces Command. And in that regard, maybe there's this sense of sovereignty coming through, but it must be recognized by the South Korean government that failure to maintain contact with the US side will break the alliance. And so when the transfer occurs from a American-led to a Korean-led, these nuances have to be attended to every single day. And the mindset of the commander is what causes that to occur. It tempers then the political mindsets that can be blown by winds of nationalism, as we are seeing in both countries right now, drifting away from a sense of oneness to a sense of two-ness. That needs to change to strengthen the alliance. And so I'll stop at that. There are plenty more things to talk about, and I'm sure we will as we get into the questions and answers and the further discussion. But thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion as it comes up.
Thank you very much, General Brooks, and also thank you for picking up on the question posted by one of our participants. I have some more questions that I can see on the screen, and we will take the questions after we have had our fourth presentation. So let me last, but by no means least, present our last speaker for today, Major General Urs Gerber. Urs Gerber was educated as a historian at the University of Bern and now serves as the president of the Foundation Council of the Swiss Armed Forces Historic Material Foundation. But maybe more relevant for today's webinar is that Major General Gerber was from 2012 to 2017 head of the Swiss delegation to the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, serving in the DMZ between North and South Korea. General Gerber has held several senior positions at the Strategic Intelligence Service in Switzerland, headed the Swiss Verification Unit, and served as head of the Euro-Atlantic Security Cooperation Division, and as the Deputy Director of the International Relations Directorate at the Swiss Armed Forces and the Ministry of Defense. In parallel to his civilian career, his military career includes serving as a company and battalion commander and several key staff assignments, including as the senior staff officer on the military strategic staff of the Chief of the Swiss Armed Forces. Urs Gerber is also a graduate from the Royal College of Defence Studies, RCDS, in London. He will talk to you about NNSC, which is maybe the less well-known entity addressing so far today. So please, Urs, the word is yours.
Thank you, Max, for having me. And it's a very nice opportunity to talk to this very distinguished audience of speakers. I assume that not all participants of this webinar are familiar with the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. Hence, let me briefly introduce NNSC to the audience. The Commission has been created in the framework of the Armistice Agreement and started its operation in August 1953 and is ever since operational in Panmunjom on a 365 24/7 basis. Since 95, only the Swedish and Swiss delegations with 5 officers each are permanently present at Panmunjom. Our third partner, which is Poland, is still representing the so-called northern side, but only on a temporary basis with visits on pen from time to time. Unfortunately, the PLA and the DPRK do not anymore recognize NNSC since 1995. Our mandate, and that's very important, our mandate is basically given by the Armistice Agreement. That means that we are on operations on the peninsula with the tasks that are given to us as long as the Armistice Agreement is in force and the parties that have signed the agreement, in our case, United Nations Command, are requesting its presence and contributions. That means basically, in a nutshell, that if there would be a peace treaty on the Korean Peninsula, or the other way around, a resumption of the Korean War, would formally end the mandate of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. So that's basically the context in which we work on the Korean Peninsula. In terms of tasks, I would not go through all the tasks, that would be boring for you. The one that I consider to be the most interesting in the framework of our today's discussion are the so-called expanded tasks that have been designed by United Nations Command and the NNSC from roughly 2005 on, which came in addition to the classical task given by the Armistice Agreement. One of them, which I would further discuss then in my talk, is the observation of large-scale exercises, which are normally led by United Nations Command, and where combined forces, ROK-US Combined Forces Command is the main training audience. So that's the one where we already gained, and particularly through my time when I served in Korea, gained some experience in terms of interaction with other forces than those that are directly involved in guarding the Armistice Agreement. Now, let's go over what is or might be the role of the NNSC in the framework of OP4 transition. That's a term that I liked, or transfer as you wish. What might be NNSC's contribution to that? First of all, basically, and General Brooks was very broadly already mentioning that clearly, NNSC and UNC, or the other way around, we sit in the same boats. We are the guardians of the Armistice Agreement, and our main task is to make sure that this Armistice Agreement is implemented correctly. So basically, that's our main partner in our daily interaction, which means that formally speaking, there are no official NNSC ties with the ROK-JCS or with CFC indeed. So that's basically a pretty important framework which we have to take into account. So basically in today's situation, all activities and operations by NNSC requested in the framework of these expanded tasks are requested by UNC MAC, by the Armistice Commission, and in this special case of the exercise observation by Commander UNC himself. This hugely important opportunity for NNSC has provided and is still providing the possibility of interaction also with the Combined Forces Command, being the main training audience of these large command post exercising. Having personally experienced a total of 11 key resolve and UFG observations, I consider these observations as important not only to familiarize CFC and NNSC with each other, but even more importantly, to gradually build transparency and confidence and even trust. Compared to that rather bumpy start in terms of expectations and misunderstandings, quantity and quality of the interaction and results have been improving considerably over time. According to my personal impression, this does particularly also include interaction and quality of NNSC with CFC staff and its respective work. These positive developments have unfortunately been negatively affected by the cancellations and reductions of the exercises due to the Singapore decisions and later to COVID-19 restrictions, as already been mentioned. Now let me go to my last point. What would I see the NNSC interaction on possibilities in a post-OPCON transfer environment? And I will focus here particularly to the ROK-US CFC, but include in that also all possibilities with the entirety of the ROK military as a whole. I personally take 4 more or less likely scenarios into consideration, explicitly excluding option 0, standing for a complete severing of any interaction. Let me start with one. That would be the more of the same. CFC is now considered a warfighting command and will remain that after OPCON transfer as well. NNSC is an organization, would by mandate and definition not be part of such a scenario. Hence, as long as armistice conditions continue, NNSC will most likely not have formal ties with or explicit task from CFC. In this scenario, UNC is to remain NNSC's formal partner. On the informal level, however, interaction could and should continue, particularly through exercise observation with CFC as main training audience. Scenario 2 might be an institutionalized interaction between NNSC, ROK-JCS, and CFC. With the ROK in the lead of CFC and given the complex inter-Korean relations, CFC might even envision to engage NNSC as a tool of transparency or confidence building towards the DPRK and indeed the outside world. Here, the practical approach could be by a sort of institutionalizing and enhancing the existing exercise observation setting. This could very well build further legitimacy as well as reducing tensions prior and during the exercise as such. Scenario 3, I call no war, no peace. There might very well be an NNSC role in a setting which I call end of war declaration, but short of a peace treaty. This scenario has been discussed since 2018 and seems to have still some attractivity among supporters of the current ROK government. Even General Brooks is quoted by saying that this option should not be excluded right away. If an armistice agreement setting would still be in place and the DPRK be more willing to cooperate or interact in security matters, NNSC might take over an active role in supporting both sides with regard to transparency and confidence building measures. Scenario 4, long-term, post-armistice conditions, which I consider to go in a framework of after a peaceful settlement setting. Though the existing NNSC mandate would expire under these conditions, there would certainly be different areas in the framework of transparency, confidence building, maybe DDR, or even security sector reform, where experience, knowledge, and capacity out of a pool of former NNSC delegations, particularly Sweden and Switzerland, could be exploited in a new setting, most probably involving additional partners accepted by all parties. One of the benefits of this body could indeed be the well-established transparency and confidence with all command structures in the southern part of the Korean Peninsula, be it ROK, MND, UNC, USFK, ROK-JCS, or indeed CFC. I consider scenarios 1 and 2 to easily be continued or implemented after OPCON transfer. For scenarios 3 and 4, time and conditions do not yet seem to be right for the time being, but should at least be kept under consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Urs, and also thank you for providing us this look into the future where we may see us heading once or if OPCON transfer happens. We have still quite a lot of time for comments and questions from our participants, so I encourage our participants to write your questions. But I'll take the opportunity as your moderator to ask, start with 2 questions. First, I would like to turn back to General Chun In-bum, and maybe if you could say something to us about how would you assess the popular and political support for OPCON transfer in South Korea. Is it a major issue? Is it something being discussed? And is there a dividing issue in the different political camps? And also I would like to, after you have addressed that, question, General Chun, to go back to David Maxwell, who had a comment on Ambassador Stevens' question. So over to you, Chun.
Thank you, Mats. I'm very disappointed that I find it as not as a so-called popular issue as you would think. People seem to be interested in the fact that they want operational control, they being the Koreans, but they really don't know what it is. And they've been influenced by these, of all things, movies that have portrayed the South Korean military to be under the thumb of a US four-star general. It's ridiculous. And it's not just one movie, it's a couple of movies that have portrayed the USFK commander as some sort of a warlord who stomps into the Blue House, screaming at the Korean president as if South Korea was a minuscule nation. And that's the perception that the Korean general public has. And I think it's the job of people like myself and others, especially the Korean military people, to help the Korean public understand what OPCON is all about and what war is all about. And so the Pandora box is already open. And unfortunately, it has become a emotional and a sovereign issue, which it is not. It is not a sovereign issue, and it should not be an emotional issue, but it has become exactly those two things. And that's where I'm very wary about the situation that we have. Relating to former Ambassador Stevens' question about Armistice OPCON, even from the early 90s, the Koreans knew that having control of their own forces was the natural evolvement of things. And I think the United States recognized that. I still remember in 2004 and 5 with Dave Maxwell that we discussed that the United States was open to discussion about wartime OPCON. And somehow during that initial period, all these disinformation and misinformation came out into the Korean public, giving the impression that the United States was unwilling to transfer OPCON, which is totally untrue, and that the price or the risks pertaining to having this transition too fast was not quoted accurately. They portrayed it as if it was about money. It's the last thing about OPCON transition is about money. It's going to cost us more, but that is not the real issue. The real issue is about security, and all of that got brushed aside. And so in answer to your question, Ambassador Stevens, I think there was an early recognition that national sovereignty was important, and that during the initial armistice transition of operational control, many people didn't even notice that it happened, and so it goes to, again, to the initial question that General Engman had about the interest in the Korean public about operational control. Another thing to relate to Ambassador Stevens' question is, I think we did not realize how, when armistice operational control was transferred to the Korean side, that the dangers of the Americans getting involved in a peninsula conflict, how dangerous that it could become. And only after the sinking of the attack by the North Koreans of our frigate, the Chun In, and the shelling of the Waipido, that the realization that armistice OPCON and wartime OPCON, there was a gap. And one of the things that we tried to do was fill that gap, but still, it's very dangerous there. And although people don't realize that, peacetime and wartime seems murky, it is very clear. The US president and the Korean president, they define what war is. And it's very simple. And so even it amazes me that many people, even people who should be knowledgeable, do not realize that wartime, which mobilizes the authority of the commander of the CFC to have control of forces, is only effective once the Korean and US president agree upon that process. And just an example of how misinformed or ill-informed we are and how much work needs to be done.
Thank you, General Chun. David, did you have some additional comment on the questions being discussed from Ambassador Stevens?
Yes, just one more nuance, since General Brooks said we were talking about nuance. You know, in 1994, when there was the return of peacetime or armistice OPCON, it was obviously a momentous decision. But what it did, it really was another example of making the alliance co-equal. Because as General Brooks laid out, and please recall what he said about wartime operational control and the structure that he described, what happens after 1994 is that, and also recall what General Chun just said about the presidents deciding what is war. What happened after 1994 is both the Korean side and the US side have to make a deliberate decision to provide forces to the ROK-US Combined Forces Command. And that's another indication of, you know, why this is not a sovereignty issue when we have the OPCON transition, because both sides have to decide to provide those forces, because the ROK-US CFC does not have operational control of any forces, you know, other than the standing headquarters, the unique standing headquarters that General Brooks decided. So both presidents decide what war is, and they make the decision to provide forces to the ROK-US Combined Forces Command. And again, that's maybe very nuanced, but it was an important decision in 1994. And I think that has put us on the road to OPCON transition. The other thing that I would point out is that the early iterations of the OPCON transition process called for the dissolution of the ROK-US CFC into two separate commands, a ROK warfighting command under the JCS and a new US Korea command. And the relationship would not be a command relationship, it would have been a supporting relationship. The ROK command would have been the supported command, and the US command, CORCOM, would have been the supporting command. And I think the US and Korean military leaders know that that would not have provided effective unity of command. And as General Brooks articulated, the one-of-a-kind, unique standing Combined Forces Command is too important to dissolve. And so I think that's why it's important to recognize the peacetime or armistice OPCON transfer in '94 as the real start point to the maturation of the alliance to this day and how it's going to evolve in the future.
Thank you, David. I'll have another question, or a couple of questions, in fact. One first that I would like to address to General Brooks, and another one to Urs Gerber. General Brooks, one of the role and the specificities and uniqueness of UNC is its member of the sending states. Do you see any kind of change in the role that the sending states would have when and if OPCON transfer happens, and also possible a somewhat closer relationship with United Nations in New York for the United Nations Command? And also I have a question that I think I could address to you, General Brooks, from Marcus Galucas. He writes the following: General Gerber raises an interesting point about the NNSC, or the NNSC successor role in conditions of armistice if peace declarations are made and in a post-armistice situation. Does the other panel members see any potential to retain an NNSC type organization even if the armistice is replaced by a different peace regime? And what are the risks and advantages? How does this relate to to the push by some to replace the armistice? And also to you, Urs, it's a question from Mr. Steve Lee, I think you know him, that after OPCON transition and when a peace process begins, what role could NNSC play in a possible peace agreement? Could they serve as a neutral body in observing disarmament in North Korea? So I turn to you, General Brooks, first.
Okay, thanks, Mats. I'll be explicit in saying that there is not an impact on sending state contributions related to the transfer of operational control of forces in wartime decided between the US and South Korea. So remember, the OPCON question is a binational question to be addressed solely within the alliance. And as David described, and certainly this was our practice, the relationship between UN command in wartime and CFC in wartime is one of support. So the UN command is the home for international commitments. The international commitments have to be rationalized into their application. So let's say that one of the original UN sending states chooses to participate again if there's a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, but says that we will limit our actions only to the territorial space of the existing South Korea. We will not go into the existing space of North Korea, air, sea, or ground. Well, it's UN command's responsibility to give them a mission that does that in support of Republic of Korea US Combined Forces Command. This is an important relationship. This is not a control relationship. There will be some degree of control over the sending state forces, and that will be exercised by UN command, which then puts them into appropriate relationship in support of the CFC mission. So I think this is an important one to understand. It doesn't change when operational control of forces in wartime moves from Korean-led to American-led to Korean-led. Now, as to the connection to UN headquarters, I think that's more a matter of how UN command ultimately does stand down when its mission is deemed to be complete. And of course, United Nations headquarters has essentially not exercised any authority or controls over UN command since 1950, shortly after its birth. That responsibility for raising, sustaining, supporting, directing UN command fell to the United States as the lead nation. So there would have to be a discussion between the lead nation, the United States of America, and New York on what to do about the existence of a UN military command. I hope that debate comes, really not a debate, that discussion comes, but not in an untimely fashion, because there is still a mission for UN command even now in Armistice. And I believe there's a continuing mission for UN command as an international body to oversee the transitions to peace. As we saw, even with the Armistice Agreement in 1953, there are significant actions that have to be taken to transition from a wartime condition into a armistice condition. Enforcement mechanisms, demilitarization actions, disarmament actions, all these sorts of things that happen at crisis termination throughout the world. And those are often enabled by an external body. The UN command is already that external body, and it would be foolish, in my view, to not make use of it. And it is a place where countries can participate. There will be a difference, in my view, between UN Command 1.0, that's the one that existed from 1950 to 1953, in particular 54 to stretch it just a bit, the sending states that contributed and the supporting states. The next one may not look the same. Some of the countries are different nowadays. Some countries don't exist anymore, and many more countries have capability to offer who were not able to do so at that time. And their interests might call for that. So UN Command 2.0 will be different. It will be other United Nations member states who send capability in support of Korea. So we'll have to see how that works out. I believe there's a role for UN headquarters, but we're not at that point yet. Thanks.
Thank you very much, General Brooks, and over to you, Urs.
Thank you for the questions, particularly also to Steve Lee, which I tried at least to allude to. General Brooks mentioned the term UNC 1.0 and UNC 2.0. I think there is some comparisons between NNSC and UNC with that regard. So yes, my answer would be yes, NNSC can play certainly a role during the peace treaty negotiations. As General Brooks was already alluding to, this process would be pretty lengthy, probably pretty bumpy, but still run, as I understand it, under the auspices of the existing Armistice Agreement. And then there would be a sort of a peace treaty. And now comes the question, is there a third party which is basically not implementing, but rather observing or inspecting and helping the parties to implement what has been decided? And I strongly believe that there is a need to this third party. It would not be NNSC 1.0 because the mandate basically would end with the end of the Armistice Agreement. But as I was already alluding to, there would be capabilities around, particularly in those countries that were participating in NNSC, to have in a leading or in another role, to have an impact on this organization in different fields. Most probably the task would that be complicated and complex that Sweden and Switzerland would need more help and more support from that. And one of the elements has already been alluded to, that might be the UN in a new form. There is another question which I would very briefly address to this. It's this question by Mark Tokola on the verification in the event of a conventional arms agreement. Sweden and Switzerland are both very active members of an organization that works in the Euro-Atlantic context, which is the OSCE, where there is a sort of a arms control regime in place with verification. That's called Vienna document. So there is a lot of experience around, and particularly Sweden and Switzerland were very active in these activities and were better, I have to say that, were better accepted by both sides in a sort of a Cold War environment, also on the eastern part of Europe, given to their independent and more or less neutral position. So yes, I would also answer this question positively, that there might be a role for a post-NNSC, or as I called it before, NNSC 0.2 or a different name, where the two countries that were, even with Poland that is still active, could also participate, where we could provide some contributions in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Urs. We have several more questions. I have one here that I think is for you, David. Will the transition of OPCON to South Korea lead to reduction or withdrawal of US forces in Korea? This is from Mr. Jin-Soo Kim. And he has also another one that maybe is more for Chun In-bum. From a pragmatic military perspective, how capable is the South Korea military to expedite and satisfy both the conditions-based OPCON transition plan and South Korea's defense reform plan? So first to you, David.
Well, first of all, as part of the OPCON transition process, there is no discussion that I'm aware of reducing U.S. troops. That's not part of the OPCON transition process. Now, however, as we know, the United States conducts periodic review of its force structure around the world, and it's always reviewed and adjustments are made We have reduced troops on the Korean Peninsula in the past, the last time in 2004 when we removed a brigade from the 2nd Infantry Division to go to Iraq, and then it did not return to Korea. And throughout the history of the alliance, there have been periodic reductions of US forces. But two things to keep in mind. As we progress toward the OPCON transition, the combined command should always be assessing its requirements, its needs, what forces, and always answer the question of what forces are necessary to be on the peninsula, what forces are necessary to be in the region, and what forces are necessary to come from the United States to support deterrence and defense. And that's an ever-changing calculus. The other thing to keep in mind is that the US Congress has placed restrictions on the reduction and withdrawal of US troops below the current level of 28,500. In the last National Defense Authorization Act, it requires if the United States, if the president decides to reduce troops, that the Secretary of Defense must certify that there will be no impact on US national security or that of our allies, South Korea and Japan, and that the Secretary of Defense must consult with our allies. Otherwise, Congress will not appropriate any funds to reduce troops, the troop level in Korea below 28,500. So I don't think that it's going to lead to the reduction of troops unless there are valid strategic and operational considerations that take place as the OPCON transition process progresses and the conditions on the Korean Peninsula evolve.
Okay, thank you, David. Over to you, Chun In-bum.
Yeah, that's a very, it's a question it's not simple to answer with a short answer. But to try to do that, yes, I believe the Republic of Korea has the capability to expedite and reach OPCON as well as Defense Reform 2.0. But the political will to do that is something that I don't see. And this is something that the political leaders really need to decide upon. If they're going to go out and start saying that they want and they're going to fight for operational control as if the United States is not willing to give it or agree to a transition, they better put their political imperatives to that kind of statement. And it's not about money. $500 billion or $5,000 billion or how much money that is not the issue. It's about sacrifices that will be needed throughout the entire Korean society. And this is something that needs to be laid out to the Korean public, and the Korean public needs to first have interest in this issue and make a rational decision and say, okay, this is the benefit and this is the cost, and say that we're going to do this. I, for one, think that because the genie is out of the bottle, there's no way of putting it back in, and we need to have this transition of OPCON, but we need to do it right. And the first thing that we need is political will, and to be able to explain to our people the exact cost of what it will cost us and the political implications. And then, we do that. And if we did, I believe that we have the capability to do so.
Thank you. I would like to give the floor to General Brooks now for addressing a few questions. And I also like if you could address the question, General Brooks, about any advice to future ROK CFC commander, and if you have any assessment or prognosis for the next 18 months and the likelihood of the transition being completed by 2022. So with these three questions, General, please.
Okay, let me make a run at it. I did post some response to the advice to a future Korean commander, but let me just summarize it very quickly and say that first, the Korean commander of CFC must rely heavily on his or her deputy commander. just as the Americans have done with their Korean deputy commanders, to provide a channel of communication into the US system of national leadership, national security leadership, and also to bring the sense of the US leadership into the deliberations of the combined force and into the alliance. So those two people, the Korean and the American commander, deputy commander, regardless of which position they're holding, are key enablers to dialogue inside of their countries and back into the alliance system. And I would encourage a Korean commander to take great advantage of that 4-star deputy American. The second point I would say is that it's really important to never lose sight of the fact that you're an alliance commander. So the Korean commander has to stand strong against unilateral pressures from his or her own country. I had to do that as the combined force commander, and might give a different advice to the US national leaders as the CFC commander than I would as the US Forces Korea commander. Same body, two different minds, and thus two different responsibilities. It should have two different types of advice. The South Korean commander must become accustomed to doing that. And that's an important part of this exercise in the transition to this point. Why the exercises are conducted the way they are, why the conditions are the way they are, which includes the approach to leader development so that the South Korean leaders are indeed able to do that. That is not easy. And I think General Chun In-bum can acknowledge this. That's not easy within the South Korean culture. It's not easy at all to stand against the Cheongwade as it gives instructions to do a certain thing. And the Korean commander has to become accustomed to doing that. So that's my advice for future commander. The next 18 months, I think, are going to be sporty, as have all periods of 18 months that you want to measure from about 1948 on. That if any 18-month period will have adventure in it. That will be the case in the coming future. I think we'll see a considerable effort by South Korea to try to accelerate dialogue with North Korea. North Korea will probably resist that until North Korea believes that they have a sufficient condition of leverage that they can move the positions of South Korea relative to what North Korea wants. And that might be to decouple with the United States. North Korea may want that so that they can deal with South Korea very directly on North-South matters and matters of reconciliation and reunification. So we'll see that. We'll see a new administration in the United States, whether it's President Trump reelected or candidate Biden being elected. In either case, it's essentially a new administration. There'll be new players. There can be new approaches that are taken, and that will create a new dynamic over the next 18 months as the new administrations get themselves set. Perhaps there'll be some maneuvering in that and posturing that tries to break the sanctions regime and the pressure regime. But this will be jousting that happens the whole time. And we'll also see, of course, Japan, Russia, and China operating in ways that are in their interest to either spoil something that's moving too fast for them, to exploit something that appears to be in deadlock, or to block something that they believe not to be in their interest. And so that's my projection of the next 18 months. And if I can just jump on Jin-Soo Kim's question about whether or not the designation of a Korean commander at the top of the command structure, the binational command structure, would destabilize the current well-coordinated binational defense posture. And additionally, in the event of a nuclear attack, which in Jin-Soo's view would trigger a regional war, how prepared is United Nations Command to coordinate with the UNC bases in Japan or other UNC or other multinational forces? The latter part of that question, let me hit first. There is a structure for overseeing and coordinating the activities that happen on the 7 bases that are in Japan. These are very important bases. They're multi-use, so they're used by Japanese self-defense forces, by US Forces Japan, and are under the authority of United Nations Command. It could thus be used by any UN sending states as well. UN Command maintains a headquarters in Japan. And a lot of people don't know that, but it's a if you will, a forward or rearward headquarters, however you wish to look at it. that is an extension of the UN Command Headquarters. A very small staff, doesn't need to be very big in the conditions of armistice, but that's who interfaces with the Japanese self-defense forces and US forces Japan on a day-to-day basis. So I think they're well postured to do that. The nuclear attack isn't the trigger. It's an expansion of attack conventionally, cybernetically, or with the nuclear capability beyond the Korean Peninsula. That's what involves Japan right away. And I think could trigger a set of regional reactions, especially if Japan says that this is first a violation of their sovereignty and requires a response for their national defense, which would then trigger decisions by the United States on the mutual defense treaty that exists with Japan, which would then trigger actions by China and Russia to try to say, stop, hit the brakes. And so the regional conflict would become political and military right away if North Korea especially were to expand military action beyond the Korean Peninsula. And that's the reality of North Korea's current capability. So all this must be thought about as we work through it. Conventional can be just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than nuclear capability in the possession of North Korea, and should not be viewed as something less of a potential regional trigger. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, General Brooks. I would like to kind of try to close in because clock is ticking, and I would like to offer an opportunity for all our panelists to say a few words as a concluding remark on a more kind of broader issue, and that is how, if any, OPCON will impact on regional stability and regional security. But I also have a specific question for you, Urs, and that is, do you see an opportunity or a possibility for the NNSC member states to be more actively involved and support, promote OPCON transfer? Or is it like General Brooks said, this is a solely bilateral issue and there is no role for, let's say, the NNSC member states? And I'll start, as we did when we kicked off this seminar, with General Chun In-bum. If you could please address this, the impact on regional stability and security, and if you have any other additional comments before we close this session. Yeah. Over to you, General.
Yeah, if we do it right, the OPCON transition, it'll make the alliance better, more redundant. It will strengthen the alliance and the security situation for Korea as well as Northeast Asia, and stability for the entire region. So, but it will not be easy. And I think that is why we need to have these kind of discussions, and we need to educate the public about the importance and the significance of OPCON transition overall. In closing, I would also like to mention about the role of the United Nations Command. There is a wide misunderstanding of what United Nations Command on the Korean Peninsula is. I am flabbergasted by some of the comments made by our political leaders who should know better. And it just is so amazing of their ignorance that I can only assume that they're doing this on purpose for political goals, which is really, really, I'm really ashamed of those kind of political leaders. Having said that, I think we need to have more understanding of the history of the United Nations Command and the role of the United Nations Command, how the United Nations Command bases itself on the Armistice Agreement, and how the Armistice Agreement keeps peace on the Korean Peninsula. One of the leading misinformation and misunderstandings about the United Nations Command right now on the Korean public is that the United Nations Command is a hindrance to inter-Korean relations, which is flat out, incorrect. There's a lot of misinformation about the recent inter-Korean activities that was hampered by the United Nations Command, which is not true. And so this is something that really concerns me. I also want to say that without the United Nations Command keeping the peace between the North Koreans and the South Koreans, let me tell you, as a battalion commander who has on the DMZ for 13 months, that if there were no United Nations command, and if the North Koreans provoked us, there would have been a lot more shooting going on. So if anybody wants to talk bad about the United Nations command, they better have a really good alternative to that structure, or else it'll be bad news for the North Koreans, the South Koreans, and the entire Korean Peninsula. So I'll just end it there.
Thank you very much. Please, over to you, David.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for a great session. I think that the OPCON transition, as General Chun said, if we do it right, it's going to be a good thing. I'm an optimist. And I think it will do a lot for the United States, surprisingly so. And I say that because this alliance relationship is going to be one that evolves and shows in practical terms how we trust our alliance partner. I mean, this is a big step forward for the OPCON transition. As I said, it's the natural evolution, but it really shows that the United States and South Korea have become equal partners in this alliance, and to trust the alliance with having a Korean commander in command of the ROK-US CFC, that sends a powerful message. We should also keep in mind that other countries, such as Japan, look at the combined command, the ROK-US Combined Forces Command, with great respect. And other countries would like to emulate that. Now, we're not going to see other command structures like that in Asia, but as we move for the Quad, perhaps the Quad Plus, this is an example of how the United States trusts its partners and how it evolves over time. And I think that's going to be really important to working with our 5 allies in the Indo-Pacific region and building coalitions of the future. So this is an example that is going to extend, I think, far beyond the Korean Peninsula, and one that's going to enhance, potentially enhance the U.S. alliance structure in the Indo-Pacific and around the world.
Thank you very much, David. On that positive note, General Brooks, if you please have a final comment.
Well, this has been an excellent panel discussion, and I always enjoy. We could go for 3 more hours on this and just begin to scratch the surface. So thanks so much for opening the door to some good dialogue, and I hope it informs it. I think that there's a great desire on the part of the United Nations Command, on the part of the Republic of Korea and the United States, to pursue the outcome of peace. The armistice was signed in 1953 as a temporary measure to stop open activity, open hostility between the combatants. But it isn't peace, as the hundreds of lives that have been lost in direct action attest since 1953. Hundreds of lives. So the pursuit of peace is really what this is about. UN Command has been an enabler of dialogue, has been a preserver of the armistice until peace can emerge to prevent a resumption of war on the Korean Peninsula. That must remain the aim in all of this. The politics of nationalism that are impacting the alliance decisions and even impacting North Korea-South Korea relationships distort the ultimate aim, which is to find a road to peace. And so we should keep the structures that do that. There are structures that are required to maintain pressure, to move toward peace, and also to maintain channels of dialogue toward peace. And until we have these conditions of peace beginning to emerge, confidence building measures, disarmament occurring, especially in the nuclear arena, and also those things that threaten large populated areas, until we have some sort of cessation of hostilities and a redefinition of relationships, these structures that exist need to exist for a longer period of time. That includes UN Command, that includes the Combined Forces Command, that includes the NNSC, in my opinion. But we can't wait until those outcomes that we seek occur before thinking about the design that comes next. Mm-hmm. Because peace must be created and then guaranteed and then sustained if we're going to ever see it. and there will be structures that are required to do that. So my hope is that this discussion today opens the door to people to think about that. The structures needed now, the changes that occur in the interim, and the long-term conditions that can lead to a stable peace in Northeast Asia. Thanks very much again for the privilege of joining you, and good luck to all of you.
Thank you very much, General Brooks. And over to you, Urs, about the regional stability implications, if possible.
I'm the last, but hopefully not the least to speak.
Yes.
I'd like to pick up what General Brooks was ending and continue that, and also pick up a point of Chun In-bum in terms of the picture that United Nations Command, or the impression that United Nations Command has in Korea. And then try to give you some answers on what might be the role in the OPCON transfer as such and afterwards. First of all, I would argue that in the technical processes, in the sort of deep military processes, it would be difficult and most probably not be appropriate if NNSC would be a part of it. I would, however, and I have to stress that, only on request of these two nations, as we have discussed. It's a bilateral agreement. It's two nations that settle their interactions on a new platform. If both nations might be interested, one, for instance, a reason that Chun In-bum was mentioning, helping to provide strategic messaging or anything else to take away this wrong picture that United Nations Command provides, being two nations, Sweden and Switzerland, which have a good reputation in Korea, even on both sides of the DMZ, to give a sort of picture that we might be supporting this role. So that might be one thing. A second thing is, that's the point that General Brooks mentioned at the end of his final remarks. We have not only to look in the next battle area, but we have to look beyond. So we have to be prepared to go beyond the current armistice condition situation and to pick up strands and avenues for the future. And there, my points that I have already mentioned might be even already picked up in the current process to go over in transition and then to deepen and widen this new setting in the future. Also on my behalf, I would like to thank you very much. It has been a very interesting discussion, providing a lot of food for thought. And I hope that we will end up in a very positive direction and contributing to peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all our viewers, and also, of course, thank you to the four panelists. It's been a pleasure hosting this webinar today. I will not try to summarize and make a final assessment of what we have been speaking about, what you have been addressing, but I like to pick up on I think is something that all four of you have mentioned, and that is the need for call it education, that there seems to be misunderstanding on what OPCON transfer, and especially the this change of command relations and the changing of hats and introducing a South Korean general and a US deputy. So there is need for some, and there are some misunderstanding when it comes to these military realities and rationales. That's one. And also, I think, which was not really on my mind before this webinar, was something that General Brooks mentioned about the need to really work hard to maintain a parallel dialogue with the national authorities for the incoming commander of CFC, be it American or South Korean, that you have an equal, open, and credible dialogue with the national authorities in order, because you work for the two presidents. So that was something that I think was worth mentioning. So with that, it's Friday afternoon, or it's maybe Friday midnight, or it's Friday morning. So thank you all for your active involvement and your very professional comments, and hope to see you all soon. And hopefully I will see you next week, General Chun, at the office in Stockholm. So thank you very much.